Welcome to the Shadow Slaves. This photograph was taken in 1882, somewhere in the American South. A black family, formal and dignified, dressed in their finest attire, poses inside a photography studio. At first glance, it resembles hundreds of other portraits from that era. A moment frozen in time. A family proud enough to pay for the privilege of being remembered. But look closer. One member of this family, a young girl standing at the edge of the frame, has something in her eyes that no one noticed for over 140 years. Something that, when a genetic historian finally examined this photograph under digital magnification, made him fall completely silent, because what he discovered wasn't just a physical trait. It was a key, a biological key encoded in her DNA. One that had survived slavery, survived erasure, survived generations of silence, and was about to unlock the true origin of an entire family whose history had been deliberately destroyed. This is the story of what was hidden in that little girl's eyes. And it will change the way you think about identity, ancestry, and what DNA remembers, even when history forgets. Before we begin, if stories like this move you, if you believe forgotten histories deserve to be told, subscribe to this channel and leave a like. It takes 2 seconds and it means everything. Now, let us go back to 1882. Dr. James Ockfer had spent 15 years reconstructing lost genealogies. His office at Howard University in Washington, D.C., was lined with framed photographs, not of his own family, but of strangers. People whose names had been erased, whose stories had been swallowed by history. Each framed image on his wall represented a case he had solved, a life reclaimed. The morning Diane walked in, it was raining. She was in her early 50s, dressed in a gray coat, and she carried a flat cardboard envelope the way someone carries something irreplaceable. Close to her chest, both arms around it, as if shielding it from the weather outside. "My grandmother left it to me," she said, placing it carefully on his desk, "and her grandmother left it to her." Nobody knows who these people are. Not their names, not where they came from, nothing. And James opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a photograph, roughly 8 by 10 inches, mounted on a thick cardboard backing, a cabinet card, the standard portrait format of the 1880s. It was in remarkable condition. The edges were browned and slightly warped, but the image itself remained sharp and clear. A family of 7 stood inside what appeared to be a photography studio. The backdrop behind them was painted to suggest a garden, a common affectation of the era. The father stood at the center, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark suit and tie. His expression was composed, almost severe, the way many people looked in photographs from that period, because long exposure times demanded stillness. Beside him, a woman, presumably the mother, sat in a wooden chair dressed in a high, colored blouse, her hands folded in her lap. Around them, 5 children were arranged with careful deliberation. 2 older boys standing on the left, 2 younger girls seated on a low bench in front, and 1 girl, the youngest, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, standing slightly apart at the far right of the frame. At the bottom of the cardboard backing, in faded ink, someone had written a date, October 14, 1882. There was no name, no location, no studio stamp on the reverse, only a faint rectangular ghost where one had once been carefully scraped away. James studied the photograph for a long moment without speaking. Then he picked up the magnifying glass from his desk. "Has anyone ever looked at this closely?" he asked. Diane shook her head. "Not really. We always assumed it was just a portrait." James brought the glass to the image, and that was when something stopped him cold. He almost missed it. The magnifying glass had moved across the photograph the way it always did. Methodically, left to right, top to bottom, cataloging details, searching for context clues, the style of clothing, the furniture in the studio, the quality of the photographic paper. These were the tools of James's trade, the small forensic markers that helped him date and place an image with precision. He had already noted several things. The high-colored suits on the boys suggested the early 1880s rather than the 1870s. The painted garden backdrop was consistent with studio practices in the American South during the Reconstruction era. The quality of the paper and the mounting card pointed to a photographer with some professional standing. Not a frontier amateur, but someone with access to decent equipment and chemical supplies. Whoever this family was, they had made a deliberate choice to be photographed by someone good. It was when the magnifying glass reached the youngest girl, the one standing apart at the far right of the frame, that James paused. Her face was turned very slightly toward the camera, as if she had moved just before the shutter was released. In that slight turn, both of her eyes were visible, and they were not the same. Even in the sepia tones of a 19th-century photograph, the difference was unmistakable. The left eye was dark, a deep, uniform darkness consistent with brown, the expected pigmentation for a black child of that era. But the right eye was lighter, noticeably, significantly lighter. Where the left eye absorbed light, the right eye reflected it differently, with an almost gray, pale quality that jumped out of the image even in monochrome. James set the magnifying glass down. He reached, instead, for the digital scanner on the shelf behind him. It took him 12 minutes to scan the photograph at high resolution and pull it onto his monitor. He used the software he had been using for years to enhance archival images, increasing contrast, adjusting gamma, sharpening focus digitally without altering the original file. When the enhanced image filled the screen, and he zoomed in on the girl's face, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a very long time. The right eye was blue-gray, clearly, unmistakably blue-gray, rendered in the subtle gradations of light that the original photograph had captured without anyone ever noticing. A black child, 1882, one brown eye, one blue-gray eye. He turned to Diane, who was watching him from across the desk. "Tell me everything you know about this family," he said. Everything. Diane knew very little. That was the honest truth, and she said so without embarrassment. The photograph had been passed down through 4 generations of women, grandmother to daughter, daughter to granddaughter, always with the same vague instruction: keep this. It matters. But no one had ever been able to say why. No names had survived alongside it. No letters, no documents, no oral history specific enough to be useful. My great-great-grandmother received it from someone she called the old woman, Diane said. That's all I know. The old woman gave it to her before she died and told her not to lose it. James nodded slowly, still staring at the screen. He typed quickly and pulled up a medical reference database he had bookmarked years ago. Not something a genealogist typically consulted, but James had learned long ago that genetics and history were not separate disciplines. They were the same story told in different languages. Waardenburg syndrome, type 2A, autosomal dominant inheritance pattern. He read the entry the way a detective reads a case file, looking for the specific, the actionable, the visible. Waardenburg syndrome is a genetic condition affecting pigmentation of the hair, skin, and eyes. The most visually distinctive features include heterochromia iridis, irises of 2 different colors, or one iris with 2 colors, and a white forelock, a patch of white or silver hair at the front of the scalp. It is caused by mutations in several genes, most commonly PX3, MITF, or EDNRB, all of which affect the development and migration of melanocytes, the cells responsible for pigmentation. James underlined the phrase, autosomal dominant, in his mind. It meant that the mutation only needed to be inherited from one parent to express itself. And it meant, crucially, that in a family line where the mutation existed, it would appear again and again, generation after generation, in roughly half of all children. If the little girl in the 1882 photograph had Waardenburg syndrome, she would have inherited it from one of her parents, and one of her parents would have inherited it from one of their parents, and so on. An unbroken biological thread running backward through time. He turned back to the enhanced image on the screen. The girl's right eye, pale and luminous against her dark face, looked back at him across 140 years. This child, he said carefully, has a genetic condition called Waardenburg syndrome. It's hereditary dominant. It doesn't skip generations the way some conditions do. Diane leaned forward.
What does that mean?
It means, James said, that this didn't start with her. James spent the rest of that afternoon in the digital archive. He scanned every millimeter of the photograph again, this time looking not at the girl's eyes, but at the other faces in the frame, searching for the thread. The two older boys showed nothing obvious. Their eyes in the enhanced image appeared uniformly dark. The mother's face was partially turned, her right eye obscured by a shadow that the original photographer had apparently not bothered to correct. A compositional oversight that had survived 140 years. The father's gaze was direct and steady, his eyes dark and symmetrical. Then James looked at the second girl, the one seated on the bench, slightly older than the child with heterochromia, perhaps 10 or 11. He had not paid her much attention before. She sat with her hands in her lap, her face fully toward the camera, her expression serious in the way of all children who had been told to hold still. Her eyes were dark, both of them uniformly dark, no heterochromia. But at the top of her head, just above her left temple, partially hidden by the careful arrangement of her hair, there was a section that the digital enhancement now made impossible to ignore. A patch, perhaps 2 inches wide, where the hair was strikingly lighter than the rest. Not gray, not simply lighter, white, bright flat white, the way a white forelock appears in old photographs. A small flag of absent pigmentation flying at the edge of an otherwise dark hairline. James sat very still. The white forelock, the hallmark of Waardenburg syndrome, present in a sibling without heterochromia. That meant the mutation had expressed differently in each child. One inheriting the iris pigmentation difference, the other inheriting the depigmented hair. Both manifestations of the same underlying genetic change. Both inherited from the same parent. He looked at the father again, then the mother, whose face was partially shadowed. He reached for his phone and called his colleague in the genetics department, a woman named Dr. Patricia Ewin, who had worked with him on 3 previous ancestry reconstruction cases. "Patricia," he said when she answered, "I need you to look at something tomorrow morning. A photograph 1882. What am I looking for? Waardenburg markers in 2 siblings, one with heterochromia, one with a white forelock." He paused. "And I need you to tell me which parent it came from, because one of those parents in the photograph has a shadow over their face, and I think that shadow is hiding something." There was a silence on the line. "I'll be there at 8, Patricia said. "Doctor." Patricia Ewin arrived at James's office with coffee and a hard drive. She was the kind of person who prepared before she asked questions. And by the time she sat down across from him, she had already pulled up 3 medical journals on Waardenburg syndrome type 2. On her laptop, she studied the enhanced photograph on James's screen without speaking for several minutes. She zoomed in on the girl with heterochromia, then on the older sister with the white forelock, then on the mother's partially shadowed face. She tilted her head slightly, the way she always did when she was thinking. "The shadow isn't hiding the eyes," she said finally. "It's hiding the hair." She was right. When James adjusted the contrast on the mother's image, pushing the digital enhancement further than he had the previous day, a detail emerged at the mother's hairline just above her left temple. The shadow that had obscured half her face had been cast by the studio lighting. But at the edge of the shadow, just barely visible, was a thin strip of lighter, toned hair, the same position as the white forelock on the older daughter. "She's the carrier," Patricia said quietly. The mutation came through her. James leaned back. A black woman in 1882 with Waardenburg syndrome. 2 children visibly expressing the trait. A photograph with no name, no location, no studio marking. The next step was clear. The Freedmen's Bureau records. After the Civil War, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, commonly known as the Freedmen's Bureau, had attempted to document the lives of formerly enslaved people across the South. The records were incomplete, imperfect, often distorted by the prejudices of the agents who created them, but they were the closest thing to a census that existed for Black Americans in the years immediately following emancipation. James had a subscription to the digitized Freedmen's Bureau database, a project completed only a few years earlier after decades of painstaking indexing by genealogists and volunteers. He searched by physical description, which the Bureau records sometimes included, looking for any notation of unusual eye pigmentation. The search took most of the morning. At 11:47, a record appeared on his screen, a labor contract dated 1866 from a district in South Carolina. The contracting party was listed as a woman. Her first name was given as Elisa. Beside her name, in the careful handwriting of the Bureau agent, was a parenthetical notation. 1 eye brown, 1 eye gray, blue, distinctive. James's hands went still on the keyboard. Elisa. The name sat on the screen like a stone dropped into still water. James stared at it for a long time before reaching for his notepad. The labor contract from the Freedmen's Bureau listed her age as approximately 35 in 1866, which would make her born around 1831. It listed no surname. Formerly enslaved people were frequently recorded without one in official documents from that period, or with the surname of a former enslaver that they had already discarded. It listed no place of origin. It listed only her name, her approximate age, the district in South Carolina where she was contracting her labor, and that single physical notation that had survived because a Bureau agent, for reasons James would never know, had thought it worth writing down. 1 eye brown, 1 eye gray, blue, distinctive. He had a name. He had a rough birth year. He had a geographical location. And he had a genetic marker that functioned in that moment as a kind of fingerprint. A biological annotation written into her body that no document could erase. The next archive was harder. Slave manifests. The shipping documents used to record the transport of enslaved people along domestic slave trade routes were among the most revealing and most brutal documents in American history. They listed enslaved people like cargo name, age, height, physical description, and the name of the person who claimed ownership. They were created not out of any concern for the humanity of the people they listed, but because transporting enslaved people across state lines required legal documentation. James searched the digitized collections held by the National Archives and several university libraries. He searched for records from South Carolina, cross-referencing with the rough birth window he had for Elisa. He searched through manifests from the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, the decades during which Elisa would have been a child, then a young woman. On the second day, he found a manifest from 1849, a coastal shipping record from Charleston, South Carolina. Among the listed individuals was a girl, age approximately 18, first name Elisa. Beside her description, the agent who had prepared the manifest had written 2 words that confirmed everything. Iris different. James read those two words several times. Iris different. In the brutal transactional language of a slave manifest, a human being's most distinctive feature. The genetic inheritance she carried from her ancestors had been recorded as a curiosity, a note in a ledger, two words that had waited 175 years to mean something. He picked up his phone and called Diane. "I found her," he said. "Her name was Elisa, and I know where she came from." Diane was at his office within the hour. She sat across from him with her coat still on, her hands clasped on the desk, listening without interrupting as James walked her through everything: the Freedmen's Bureau record, the labor contract, the slave manifest from Charleston. He showed her each document on screen, reading the relevant passages aloud, watching her face as the pieces assembled themselves into something coherent. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Elisa," she said, as if testing the weight of it. That was her name. That's what the records suggest. The physical description matches the heterochromia, the notation in the labor contract, the timing. It's the same woman with a high degree of confidence. She is the mother in this photograph. Diane nodded slowly. Then she said, "Where did she come from before Charleston? Before South Carolina?" That was the question James had been waiting for. And it was the question he could not answer from documents alone. He had already contacted a genetic genealogy laboratory, one that specialized in ancestral DNA reconstruction using historical family photographs as a starting point. The technology was relatively recent and still imperfect, but it had been used successfully in several high-profile ancestry cases in the preceding years. By analyzing the visible phenotypic markers in archival photographs, skin tone, eye color, facial morphology, in combination with genetic databases of known Waardenburg syndrome mutations, it was possible to narrow the geographic and ethnic origin of a mutation with meaningful precision. But there was another avenue: Diane herself. If she was a descendant of the family in the photograph, and the chain of custody through 4 generations of women made that overwhelmingly likely, then her own DNA carried the answer. "Have you ever done a genetic ancestry test?" James asked. "No." She paused. "Should I?" "I think you should, but not one of the commercial ones. I want to refer you to Patricia's lab. They can run a full mitochondrial DNA sequence that traces your maternal line directly, mother to mother to mother, as far back as the data can reach." Diane agreed without hesitation. The test took 11 days. When Patricia called James with the preliminary results, her voice had a quality he recognized: the careful, restrained excitement of a scientist who has found something significant and is not yet ready to say how significant. "The mitochondrial haplogroup," Patricia said, "is L3. Specifically a subclade that the database associates with a very narrow geographic corridor." She paused. "West Africa, Sierra Leone, James. The Waardenburg mutation in this lineage matches a variant that's been documented in exactly one population group in the existing literature." The population group was the Mende. James knew the name. Most historians of the Atlantic slave trade did. The Mende people of Sierra Leone had been among the most heavily targeted ethnic groups during the final decades of the legal transatlantic slave trade, a period of intensified raiding and trafficking that preceded the British naval blockade of the West African coast. Their cultural identity, their language, their social structures had been among the most violently disrupted by the trade. They were also, as Patricia's database search confirmed, the only documented population in West Africa in which the specific PAX3 gene mutation associated with Elisa's form of Waardenburg syndrome had been recorded in more than one individual. James spent 2 days reading everything he could find about the Mende. Their communities, their history of resistance, their presence in the documented records of the transatlantic slave trade. And then, while searching through the digitized collection of the Amistad Research Center in New Orleans, a repository of records related to the African American experience, he found something he had not been looking for. A letter. It was handwritten, dated 1891, and addressed to no one by name. The writer identified herself only as a woman who was once called by another name. The letter was written in careful, deliberate English, the English of someone who had learned the language as an adult in a country that was not their own. It had been donated to the archive in 1934 by a family in Charleston, along with a small collection of papers, and had been cataloged but rarely accessed. James read it twice before he was certain of what he was looking at. The woman described her childhood in a village near a river. She described being taken at night with other members of her family by men who spoke a language she did not understand. She described a ship. She described arriving somewhere cold and unfamiliar. She described learning a new name, Elisa, because the name she had been given at birth was considered unpronounceable by the people who now claimed to own her. And near the end of the letter, in a passage that made James set down his coffee cup and sit very still, she wrote, "My mother had eyes that did not match. One dark as river mud, one pale as morning sky. She told me your mother had the same. She told me it was a sign that we came from a particular place, and that no matter how far we were taken, that sign would follow us." James read that sentence 4 more times. Then he called Diane. He read her the letter over the phone. All of it. When he reached the passage about the eyes, she made a sound he could not quite name. Not a word, not a cry, something in between. He waited until she was ready to speak. She wrote it herself. Diane said finally, "Yes," in her own hand. She remembered everything: her village, her mother, the name she was born with. He paused. She didn't write that name in the letter. I think she was protecting it, keeping it private. But she described the place, the river, the geography. James had spent the previous evening referencing the geographic details in the letter against historical maps of Sierra Leone from the mid-19th century. The river she described, its width, its proximity to the coast. The type of tree she mentioned growing along its banks was consistent with the Sewa River in the southern region of Sierra Leone. The Sewa River Valley had been a Mende heartland for centuries. Patricia's mitochondrial DNA results, the Waardenburg mutation variant, the letter, the geography, they all pointed to the same place, the same people, the same origin. A family that had been photographed in a studio in South Carolina in 1882, with no name recorded and no history attached, had come from the banks of the Sewa River in Sierra Leone. Their ancestor had been taken from that river valley sometime in the 1830s or 1840s, during the final brutal years of the transatlantic slave trade. She had survived the crossing. She had survived enslavement. She had raised children and grandchildren on soil that was not her own. And she had carried in her eyes, in her children's hair, in the DNA of every descendant who followed, an unbreakable biological record of where she had come from. James thought about the little girl in the photograph, the one standing apart at the far right of the frame, her face turned just slightly toward the camera, one eye dark and one eye pale. A 7-year-old child in 1882 who had no way of knowing that the thing that made her different was also the thing that would one day lead a historian 140 years into the future to the name of her great-grandmother's river. He thought about what it meant to carry something in your body that you cannot see or feel or name. Something that outlasts everything else. That outlasts the ships and the auctions and the ledgers and the silence. He sat with that thought for a long time. Then he began preparing what he would tell Diane the following morning. Diane came to James's office last time on a Thursday morning in October, almost exactly 6 weeks after she had first walked in with the photograph pressed against her chest in the rain. She sat across from him at the same desk. The photograph was there between them, still in its cardboard envelope, still in the careful condition in which 4 generations of women had kept it. James laid everything out in order: the Freedmen's Bureau record, the labor contract, Patricia's DNA analysis, the letter from the Amistad Research Center, the historical maps, the Mende people of the Sewa River Valley in Sierra Leone. Each document was a step in a staircase that descended 1 generation at a time, from a photography studio in South Carolina in 1882 to a village on a West African riverbank sometime in the 1830s. Diane listened to all of it without speaking. She looked at each document. She held the letter, a printed copy, the original too fragile to handle freely, and read the passage about the mismatched eyes twice. When James finished, she looked at the photograph for a long time. She didn't know, Diane said quietly. The little girl, she didn't know what her eyes meant. No, James said, she couldn't have. But her great-grandmother knew. She wrote it down. Diane looked up. She wanted someone to know. She wrote it in a language that wasn't hers, in a country that wasn't hers, and she left it for someone to find. James nodded. You found it, he said. It just took 140 years. Diane picked up the photograph and looked at the little girl at the edge of the frame. The girl who had moved slightly just before the shutter closed. The girl whose pale right eye had caught the studio light in a way that no one had noticed or thought to question for a century and a half. The family had no recorded name. Their story had been deliberately, systematically erased, first by the institution of slavery, then by the indifference of history. But the erasure had not been complete. It had never been complete, because written into the biology of that child, into the cells of her iris, into the genes she had inherited from her mother, who had inherited them from her mother, who had been taken from the banks of a river in Sierra Leone, was a record that no document could destroy. Diane set the photograph back down on the desk. She did not speak for a long moment. Then she said, her name was Elisa, but somewhere on the Sewa River, she had another name. And now I know where to look for it. She picked up the photograph, tucked it back into its cardboard envelope, and held it against her chest, both arms around it, the same way she had carried it into this office 6 weeks before in the rain. DNA does not forget. It cannot be confiscated, burned, or renamed. It simply waits.